Hi guys, Craig here and welcome back to my channel. So we're doing things a little bit differently today. We've got a new camera and a new mic setup. So we're testing it for the first time in this video today. So any feedback would be greatly appreciated. So the case that I'm going to talk about today is a child murder case that took place in Indianapolis in October 1965. And it's often called one of the worst crimes the state has ever known. Sylvia Likens, aged just 16, was held captive and subjected to unimaginable abuse and torture, and that torture was dished out by her supposed caregiver, Gertrude Baniszewski. So if you're interested in this video, please give it a big thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into the video. Likens was born on January 3rd, 1949. She was the third of 5 children born to carnival workers, Lester and Elizabeth Likens. Sylvia was born between 2 sets of twins, Daniel and Diana, 2 years older than she was, and Benny and Jenny, who were 1 year younger. Sylvia's little sister Jenny suffered from polio, and this caused her to walk with a permanent limp, and also she had to wear a brace on her bad leg. Lester and Elizabeth's marriage was pretty unstable. They struggled financially, so this meant that they had to travel with the carnival scene, selling candy and other things at their stall. Lester and Elizabeth's sons often travelled with them on the carnival scene, but due to concerns about the education and well-being of their youngest daughter, they didn't like Sylvia and Jenny travelling with them, so both girls frequently stayed with their grandparents, while their mother and father travelled the carnival scene with their brothers. In her teenage years, Sylvia Likens would often earn money by babysitting for local residents. She would often give all of the money she earned to her mother to help the family's finances. Sylvia was described as a lively, kind and generous young woman. So now let me tell you a little background on the monster that would be Gertrude Baniszewski. Gertrude Nadine Baniszewski was born on September 19th, 1928, to her mother Molly and her father Hugh. They were from a working class family and her parents were of American and Dutch descent. Gertrude was the third of 6 children. On October 5th, 1939, Gertrude would witness the death of her father when he died suddenly of a heart attack, age 50. 6 years later, she would drop out of high school at age 16 to marry 18-year-old John Baniszewski. John Baniszewski was originally from Youngstown, Pennsylvania, and although John Baniszewski was a volatile man, the couple would remain together for 10 years prior to divorcing. Following her divorce, Gertrude married a man called Edward, but the marriage would only last 3 months before he as well divorced her. Shortly after this, Gertrude remarried her first husband, John Baniszewski, and she would go on to have 2 more children with him. But then in 1963, the couple would divorce for a second and final time. So just weeks after her divorce, Gertrude Baniszewski started a relationship with a 22-year-old man named Dennis Lee Wright. He would also go on to physically abuse her. She would go on to have 1 child with Dennis, who she would name Dennis Jr. But shortly after the birth, Dennis Sr. abandoned both Gertrude and his newborn son. So by 1965, Gertrude Baniszewski would live alone with her 7 children. Paula, age 17, Stephanie, age 15, John, age 12, Marie, aged 11, Shirley, age 10, James, 8, and Dennis Jr., aged 1. Although Gertrude Baniszewski was 36 years old and 5 foot 6 inches in height, she weighed only 100 pounds and was often described as haggard, underweight, and an asthmatic chain smoker who frequently suffered from depression due to her failed marriages and ever-growing family. In addition to periodic checks that she would receive from her first husband, Gertrude would also do some work around town. She would do things like ironing and sewing in order to earn money to feed her family. So by June 1965, Sylvia Likens resided in Indianapolis with her family. But on July 3rd, her mother was arrested and charged with shoplifting. So shortly after this, Lester Likens arranged for his 2 daughters to board with Gertrude Baniszewski while him and later his wife would travel with the carnival scene once again. At the time of this boarding agreement, Gertrude Baniszewski assured Lester Likens that she would care for his daughters as if they were her own, until he and his wife returned. So shortly after July 4th, both Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny moved into the Baniszewski household. And this was on the understanding that Lester Likens would pay Gertrude Baniszewski $20 a week for the upkeep of his daughters. In the initial weeks that both Jenny and Sylvia stayed at the Baniszewski household, they were subjected to very little discipline or abuse. In fact, it was noted that Sylvia would willingly participate in housework while dancing around the kitchen to pop songs, and both girls would often attend Sunday school with the Baniszewski children. So although Lester Likens agreed to pay Gertrude $20 a week in exchange for care for his daughters, these checks would often not come, or they would turn up 2 or 3 days late. In response to this, Gertrude started taking out her frustration on the girls. She would beat them with a wooden paddle, saying, "I looked after you two bitches for a week for nothing." On one occasion in late August, it was noted that both girls were beaten 15 times with a wooden paddle due to Paula telling her mother that the girls overindulged at a church feast. So by mid-August 1965, Gertrude Baniszewski started focusing her abuse solely on Sylvia Likens. We think that her primary motivation to this would be because she was jealous of Sylvia's physical appearance. The initial abuse towards Sylvia included things like beating her and refusing her significant food, which would later go on to cause Sylvia to eat scraps and spoiled food from the dustbins. On another occasion in late August, Sylvia Likens was humiliated when she stated that she actually had a boyfriend that she had met while the family was living in Long Beach, California. In response to this, Gertrude had asked Sylvia, "Have you ever done anything with a boy?" Sylvia, slightly confused about the meaning of what Gertrude was getting at, said, "Well, yeah, I guess I have. We went ice skating together and we went to the park." She confessed to one day sleeping under the covers with her boyfriend at the time. Upon hearing this, Gertrude Baniszewski asked Sylvia, "Why did you do this?" To which Sylvia shrugged and says that she didn't know. So several days later, Gertrude Baniszewski would bring up the subject once again by saying to Sylvia, "You're sure getting a fat belly on you. I think there might be a baby in there." Sylvia, thinking that Gertrude was joking, laughed it off and says, "Yeah, I am getting a bit fat. Maybe I should go on a diet." Gertrude would then snap at Sylvia and inform her and the other girls in the house that whenever you'd done something with a boy, you would inevitably end up pregnant. She then turned and kicked Sylvia Likens in her genitals. Paula, who herself at this point was overweight and 3-month pregnant, then decided to join in on the attack, throwing Sylvia off of a chair onto the floor, stating that, "You don't have the right to sit on one of my chairs." On another occasion, at a family supper, Gertrude Baniszewski and her daughter Paula, who was accompanied by a neighbourhood boy called Randy Gordon Leeper, force-fed Sylvia a hot dog loaded with condiments, forcing her to be sick. Sylvia Likens would later have to eat what she had regurgitated. In what would be Sylvia's only act of retaliation, she spread a rumour at the school stating that Paula and Stephanie Baniszewski were prostitutes. While at school, Stephanie Baniszewski was jokingly propositioned by a boy, who would go on to tell her that Sylvia Likens started the rumour. Upon returning home that day, Stephanie asked Sylvia about the rumours, to which Sylvia admitted it. Stephanie would then go on to punch Sylvia straight in the face. However, when Stephanie Baniszewski's 15-year-old boyfriend, Coy Hubbard, heard about the rumours, he viciously attacked Sylvia, pulling her hair, beating her head against the wall, and kicking her in the stomach. And if this wasn't enough, when Gertrude herself found out about it, she again beat Sylvia with a wooden paddle. On yet another occasion, Paula Baniszewski beat Sylvia so hard around the face that it actually broke her wrist. And on returning from the hospital that evening, She then proceeded to beat Sylvia some more with the cast on her arm. Gertrude Baniszewski would also, on occasions, force Sylvia's sister Jenny to partake in the beatings. Jenny herself would be beaten if she did not comply. Coy Hubbard and several of his classmates were frequent visitors at the Baniszewski household. They would often come round solely to beat and torture, both mentally and physically, Sylvia. One evening, to entertain Gertrude and her teenage accomplices, Sylvia Likens was forced into the living room, forced to strip naked, and then brutally forced to insert a glass Coca-Cola bottle into her genitals. Gertrude Baniszewski eventually stopped Sylvia Likens from going to school, and the excuse she gave was because Sylvia had stolen another girl's swimsuit. And for this act of supposed theft, Gertrude Baniszewski beat Sylvia Likens for 15 minutes with a 3-inch thick police belt. And after this, Gertrude then changed the conversation to premarital sexual relations, before once again turning and kicking Sylvia Likens in the genitals multiple times. Later that night, Gertrude would also go on to burn all of Sylvia Likens' fingertips with matchsticks. The Likens sisters were often fearful and scared to tell anybody about the abuse and torture they were suffering. They thought that by telling someone it might actually make their situation worse. Jenny in particular really struggled, as she really did want to tell family members about what was going on, but she was just too scared that they would then turn the focus of the abuse onto her. In July and August, the Likens girls' parents arrived in town for a visit, but strangely, when their parents did visit, neither girl actually told them of the abuse they were suffering. And this is likely down to they were scared of the repercussions it would cause with Gertrude. On the day that their parents left town, immediately after shutting the front door when they left, Gertrude actually turned to Sylvia and says, "Well, Sylvia, what are you going to do now that they're gone?" I think this shows the sick and sadistic mind of Gertrude Baniszewski, teasing the young girl. On one occasion, in late September, the girls encountered their older sister, Diana Shoemaker, at a local park. Both Jenny and Sylvia decided to tell Diana about what was going on in the Baniszewski household, but at the time, neither sister actually gave Gertrude's address. And because Diana thought that the girls must be exaggerating their situation, she didn't follow it up. Several weeks later, the girls, accompanied by Marie Baniszewski, once again met their sister in a local park. And when Sylvia told her sister that she was hungry, Diana gave her a sandwich. Sylvia decided to keep this information from Gertrude, but later that night, Marie Baniszewski told her mother. Gertrude absolutely erupted and seen this as an act of gluttony. She and Paula would then go on to choke and bludgeon Sylvia Likens, and then they would subject her to a boiling hot, scalding bath. Due to the heat of the bath, Sylvia Likens kept passing out, but every time she'd done this, Gertrude would bang her head against the bath to wake her up. Shortly after this incident took place, an anonymous local man phoned the local high school and says there was a girl living in the Baniszewski household that was walking around with open sores all over her body. And because Sylvia hadn't been in school in nearly a week, the local nurse decided to follow this up. But when she arrived at the Baniszewski household, Gertrude informed her that Sylvia had run away, and that the open sores on her body was due to Sylvia refusing to maintain a decent personal hygiene. She would also go on to tell the nurse that Sylvia was a bad influence on her own kids and on her own sister Jenny, and that she was actually glad that she had run away. After the nurse left, the school made no further investigations in regards to Sylvia Likens. The neighbours of the Baniszewski household were a couple called Raymond and Phyllis, who actually visited the Baniszewski household twice during the abuse of Sylvia Likens. On the first occasion, they did witness Paula Baniszewski punching Sylvia in the face, and on the second visit they did note that Sylvia's appearance was meek and zombified, yet they decided not to report anything to the authorities. On October 1st, Diana Shoemaker, the sister of Jenny and Sylvia, actually found out Gertrude's address and tried to initiate contact with the girls, but Gertrude stated that she would not allow her to see Jenny or Sylvia due to not having written permission from her parents. She then slammed the door in Diana's face and told her to get off her property. A few weeks later, when Jenny encountered Diana in the park once again, she inquired about Sylvia's well-being, to which Jenny replied, "I'm sorry, I can't tell you because I'll get in trouble." Due to the increase in frequency of the beatings that Sylvia was receiving, she actually became incontinent. She was denied access to a bathroom, thus resulting in her constantly wetting herself. As a form of punishment for the incontinence, Gertrude Baniszewski threw Sylvia Likens into the basement, and she was frequently deprived of any food or water. On one occasion in the cellar, after viciously beating Sylvia Likens, Gertrude held out a knife and says to Sylvia, "Come on Sylvia, why don't you fight me back?" To which Sylvia replied, "I wouldn't know how." The neighbourhood children were also occasionally charged 5 cents to humiliate, to beat, to burn and to mutilate Sylvia Likens. Throughout her period of time in the basement, Gertrude Baniszewski and the local neighbourhood children would often throw Sylvia into a scalding hot bath and then rub salt into the wounds. And in order to muffle her screams, they would actually place a urine-soaked rag into her mouth. On one occasion, John Baniszewski Jr. rubbed urine and faeces from his 1-year-old brother's diaper into Sylvia's mouth and asked her to wash it down with a glass of water, and told her it was the only water she would be receiving. Gertrude then told Sylvia that she could go back to sleeping upstairs as long as she did not wet herself. But that night, Sylvia Likens secretly asked her sister Jenny to get her a glass of water. And the following morning, when Gertrude Baniszewski discovered this, she demanded that Sylvia go into the kitchen. And this is when she began carving the words, "I am a prostitute and proud of it," into Sylvia's abdomen with a heated needle. When Gertrude was unable to finish the branding, she ordered 14-year-old Richard Hobbs to finish the job. After this, Richard Hobbs and Shirley Baniszewski would once again throw Sylvia Likens back into the basement. A few hours later, Gertrude Baniszewski returned with some of the neighbourhood children, who all pointed and laughed at her. Gertrude would go on to say, "Look Sylvia, what man's gonna have you now with that branded on your skin?" To which Sylvia replied, "I guess there's nothing I can do." Later that night, Sylvia Likens said to her sister Jenny, "Jenny, I know you love me, but I am going to die in this house. I can tell." The following day, Gertrude Baniszewski awoke Sylvia Likens, telling her that she had to write a letter and that she would dictate the context. This letter was to mislead her parents and make them think that Sylvia had run away from the Baniszewski household. The contents of this letter was to frame a group of local guys of extensively abusing and mutilating Sylvia after she had agreed to engage in sexual relations with them. After Sylvia had finished writing the letter, Gertrude proceeded to tell her that "I'm going to take you to a forest and leave you there to die." After hearing this, Sylvia tried to flee the Baniszewski household, trying to escape out of the front door. But unfortunately, Gertrude caught her before she could go any further. And because of this, Gertrude grabbed a curtain pole and started beating Sylvia around the head with it. After 5 minutes of beating her around the head with this curtain pole, Coy Hubbard took the pole from Gertrude and with one swift act knocked Sylvia Likens out cold. On the morning of October 26th, Sylvia Likens was unable to speak or correctly coordinate her limb movements. This spooked Gertrude a bit, so she moved Sylvia to the kitchen, where she tried to give her a glass of milk. But when Sylvia couldn't get the milk from her hand to her mouth, Gertrude threw her back in the basement out of frustration. Shortly after this, Sylvia became really delirious, and you could hear her moaning and grumbling, but not quite making full sentences. Paula Baniszewski would then go on to ask Sylvia to recite the English alphabet, but Sylvia could only make slight groaning and mumbling noises, and then would actually go on to defecate herself. Gertrude then ordered Sylvia to clean herself up, although she could barely move. That afternoon, several of Sylvia's tormentors gathered in the basement. Sylvia jerkingly moved her arms about in an attempt to point at her tormentors. She made muffling statements, saying things like, "You're Ricky, you're Bertie, I know who you are," before Gertrude ultimately snapped, "Shut up, Sylvia." Minutes after this, Sylvia tried to bite a rotten pear that she found on the floor, stating that she couldn't bite it because her teeth felt loose. To which Jenny replied, "Don't you remember, Sylvia? You lost all your teeth." Because of Sylvia defecating herself earlier that day, John Baniszewski Jr. decided to take a hose down to the basement where he proceeded to hose her down. Sylvia again tried to escape the basement at this point, but collapsed before she could get there. And as she collapsed, Gertrude Baniszewski started violently stamping on her head. It was at this point that Sylvia Likens died at the age of 16 due to her injuries. When Stephanie Baniszewski realised that Sylvia wasn't breathing anymore, she began to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But as she was doing this, Gertrude just kept on shouting, "Faker, faker, faker. She's not actually dead, she's just faking." Shortly after 5 p.m, Richard Hobbs returned to the Baniszewski household, but he slipped on some water and fell heavily to the basement floor. When he looked up, he was confronted with the sight of Stephanie Baniszewski cradling Sylvia Likens' lifeless body, crying and sobbing. Gertrude then proceeded to tell him to go and call the police. So the police arrived at the Baniszewski household at approximately 6:30 p.m. Gertrude Baniszewski led the officers to Sylvia Likens' bruised, battered and lifeless body, before handing them the letter that she'd previously made Sylvia write, also claiming that Sylvia had just returned home and that Gertrude herself had been trying to doctor her for the last hour and a half, but sadly she had died. Then, Paula Baniszewski, who was clutching a Bible, stated to everyone that was present that Sylvia Likens' death was meant to happen. She then looked over to Jenny and says to her, "If you want to stay with us, we'll treat you like we're own sister." As previously instructed by Gertrude, Jenny then went on to recite the rehearsed line about how Sylvia had run away and returned that day. But when Gertrude turned away, Jenny Likens whispered to a police officer, "If you get me out of here, I will tell you everything." In a formal statement given by Jenny Likens, it was enough evidence for police to arrest Gertrude Baniszewski, Paula Baniszewski, Stephanie Baniszewski and John Baniszewski Jr. on the suspicion of Sylvia Likens' murder. That day, both Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs, two of the neighbourhood children, were also arrested. They were all held without bail pending the trial. Initially, Gertrude Baniszewski denied all involvement in Sylvia Likens' murder, but by October 27th, Gertrude had admitted to knowing that some of her kids and the neighbourhood children were tormenting and beating Sylvia. She would even go as far as to state that her daughter Paula Baniszewski was the one that ordered most of the beatings. Gertrude would go on to admit to making Sylvia Likens sleep in the basement due to her wetting the bed. She became very evasive when officers tried to say to her that she probably became incontinent due to the level of beatings that she was receiving. Lacking any remorse, Paula Baniszewski also signed a statement saying that she had participated in the beatings and tortures of Sylvia Likens. John Baniszewski Jr. would also sign a statement saying that he was involved in some of the beatings occurred by Sylvia Likens. 5 other neighbourhood children who participated in some of the abuse were also arrested. They were all charged with causing injury to a person, but were subsequently released into the custody of their parents. The autopsy of Sylvia Likens' body indicated that she had 150 different wounds on her body at the time of her death. Her injuries included things like cuts, burns, mutilation of her genitals, muscle damage, nerve damage. It was also stated that all of Sylvia Likens' fingernails had been pulled right back. The official cause of death for Sylvia Likens was said to be a subdural hematoma, which basically means a bleed on the brain from the time that Gertrude Baniszewski repeatedly stomped on her head. Rigor mortis had fully set in by the time police officers got to Sylvia Likens' body, which means that she was probably dead for up to 8 hours before the police were called. On December 30th, 1965, the grand jury returned and delivered a verdict of guilty. Gertrude Baniszewski, Paula Baniszewski and John Baniszewski Jr. were all indicted with first-degree murder. Also on that day at a separate trial, both Richard Hobbs and Corey Hubbard were also indicted with first-degree murder. All were charged with repeatedly attacking Sylvia Likens with premeditated malice. The trial of Gertrude Baniszewski and her children began on the 18th of April 1966. Stephanie Baniszewski had agreed to testify in court if she would receive immunity for her part in the beatings. Gertrude herself pled not guilty, maintaining that she was insane at the time of the attacks. The trial of the 5 defendants lasted 17 days before the jury retired to consider the verdict. On May 19th, 1966, after deliberating for 8 hours, the panel of 8 men and 4 women found Gertrude Baniszewski guilty of first-degree murder, recommending that she received life imprisonment. Paula Baniszewski was also found guilty of second-degree murder. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard and John Baniszewski Jr. were also found guilty of manslaughter. Upon hearing the judge pronounce the verdicts, Gertrude and her children sobbed uncontrollably. On May 25th, both Gertrude Baniszewski and Paula Baniszewski were sentenced to life imprisonment. On the same day, Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard and John Baniszewski Jr. all received sentences ranging from 2 years to 25 years. Over the next 14 years that Gertrude Baniszewski served in prison, she would become a model prisoner, and some prisoners would even go on to refer to her as mother. In 1985, Gertrude Baniszewski was released from prison and she would move to Iowa. She would never accept responsibility for what she'd done to Sylvia Likens, stating that she couldn't recall any of her actions from that time. She would go on to blame her actions on some of the medication that she was on. Gertrude Baniszewski lived in relative obscurity for the rest of her life, and on June 16th, 1990, at the age of 61, she would die of lung cancer. So guys, that was the horrible and brutal story of the murder of Sylvia Likens. If you liked this video, please give it a big thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. And I will see you all next time. Bye!